The shovel blade screamed against the frozen earth. Each strike sent a juddering shock up the handle, through Elara's arms, and into the deep weariness of her shoulders. The ground, a dark and stubborn conglomerate of soil and frost, yielded only in grudging chips and splinters. Beside the growing trench, a mound of dark earth steamed faintly in the cold, a stark wound on the pale, straw-colored grass of late autumn. Her breath plumed in the air, a rhythmic ghost accompanying the scrape and thud of her work. She did not rush. She set a pace her body could endure from dawn until the light failed, a rhythm of strike, lift, and toss that had become as natural as breathing. A few feet away, lying with his nose tucked under his tail, Fen watched her. The dog, a shepherd mix of indeterminate age and origin, was a creature of profound patience. His amber eyes, intelligent and old, followed her every movement. He had been her father's dog, and now he was hers, a silent, furry anchor in the vast, quiet landscape. He did not question the digging. When she worked, he watched. When she rested, he rested. When she looked at him, he would lift his head and thump his tail once against the cold ground, a simple, unwavering vote of confidence. She was carving a line in the earth, a straight and determined path from the back of her small cabin to the moss-chinked stone foundation of the root cellar, some 40 feet away. The trench was already 3 feet deep and just wide enough for her shoulders to pass. It was slow, brutal work. The topsoil had been easy enough, but now she was into the dense, rocky clay that held the memory of glacial cold. The sound of an approaching wagon, the creak of wood and the jingle of harness, broke the day's quiet rhythm. Elara paused, leaning on the shovel handle, and wiped a trickle of sweat from her temple with the back of a muddy glove. Mister. Silas Blackwood pulled his team to a halt on the track that ran past her property. He was a man made of straight lines and hard opinions, his face a road map of winters endured. He sat high on the wagon seat, a bale of hay and sacks of flour behind him, and looked down at the trench, then at her. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" His voice was rough, like gravel turning over. It wasn't unkind, but it was heavy with the certainty of his own rightness. Elara looked at the trench, then back at him. "I'm digging," she said. He grunted, a sound of profound disbelief. "I can see that. A body would have to be blind not to. What for? You putting in a new privy halfway to your cellar?" He looked around the empty landscape, the rolling hills already brown and braced for snow, the dark line of the pine forest on the ridge. "Expecting a lot of company?" "I have a plan," she said. Her voice was quiet, carrying just enough on the thin air to reach him. "A plan." "Mister." Blackwood shifted on his seat, wrapping the reins around the brake handle. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "Your father, he had plans too. Read all his books, filled his head with ideas from places that ain't this one. This valley has its own rules, Elara. You can't fight it with plans from a book. You bend to it, or it breaks you." "This was his plan," she said, and the admission cost her something. He softened slightly, his gaze falling on the small, sturdy cabin her father had built. "He was a good man, your father, a good builder, but he didn't always have a practical mind. Digging trenches before the ground freezes solid. It's a waste of strength you'll need come January." He gestured with his chin toward the sky. "Look at that. Geese were gone a month ago. The wind's got a knife in it already. We're in for a hard one. You should be splitting wood, not playing in the dirt." "The wood is split," she replied, her gaze moving to the neat, shoulder-high stacks of oak and maple that lined the eastern wall of the cabin, enough to last 2 winters. "The larder is full. The roof is patched." He saw it was true. He saw the precision of the wood piles, the new tar on the chimney flashing, the neatly banked earth around the cabin's foundation. She was not idle. This was something else. This was obsession. "Wait until the first heavy snow," he said, shaking his head as if closing a ledger. "You'll see how foolish this is." He clucked to his horses, and the wagon groaned back into motion, leaving Elara alone in the vast quiet with the dog and the trench. She watched until the wagon was a small shape on the horizon before turning back to her work. She lifted the shovel. "It'll work," she thought. The blade bit into the earth. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, she opened her father's journal. The pages were filled with his precise architectural script and detailed drawings. He had been an engineer in a city back east before coming here, a man who believed in stress loads and tensile strength, in physics and foresight. He had studied the patterns of the old winters, the stories of the first people, the records kept in the town hall. He'd noted the 30-year cycle, the signs of the coming White Death, a blizzard so vast and deep it could bury the world for a week. He had died before he could build it, a sudden fever in the spring, leaving her with the cabin, the land, and the journals. The drawings were clear. A network of tunnels, no more than 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, shored up with timber, connecting the 3 vital points of their homestead: the cabin for warmth, the root cellar for food, and the barn for the animals. A closed system, impervious to the wind and the snow. "The earth provides the best insulation," he had written. "A constant 40 degrees, no matter the fury above. The key is ventilation and solid bracing. A man can survive anything if he has shelter, food, and purpose." Elara traced the lines of the drawing with a calloused finger. Her purpose was laid out before her, a trench in the ground, a plan on a page. Mr. Blackwood's words echoed in her mind. Wait until the first heavy snow. She closed the book. She would be ready. The days grew shorter, colder. The work consumed her. After digging a 20-foot section of the main trench, she began the second, more difficult phase, the shoring. She took her father's axe and saw into the woods behind her property, felling young, straight pines, their scent sharp and clean in the cold air. She limbed them, cut them into 8-foot lengths, and dragged them back to the cabin, one by one. Fen trotted beside her, a silent companion on her laborious journeys. Her muscles screamed, her back ached with a fire that never quite went out, but the pile of timbers grew steadily. She worked with a carpenter's precision, cutting the posts and ceiling beams, notching them so they would lock together in a sturdy rectangular frame. Her father had taught her how to handle tools, how to respect the grain of the wood. Measure twice, cut once. His voice a constant, gentle murmur in her memory. She lowered the first frame into the trench. It fit perfectly. Then another and another. Between the frames she wedged thick planking, creating solid walls. The tunnel began to take shape, a wooden throat leading into the darkness of the earth. Once a week, a young man named Liam drove the supply wagon out from town for the scattered homesteads in the valley. He was quieter than the other men, with observant eyes and a way of moving that was careful and deliberate. He stopped at Elara's place last. The first time he saw the growing line of timber frames disappearing into the ground, he didn't mock her. He simply watched for a long moment from his wagon seat. "That's a lot of work for one person," he said, his voice mild. "It needs to be done," Elara answered, not pausing in her work of setting a new post. He swung down from the wagon, carrying her order, a sack of oats, a block of salt, and a new whetstone. He set them on her porch, but he didn't leave right away. He walked to the edge of the trench and looked down at the construction. "That's a clever joint," he said, pointing to the notched corner of a frame. A half-lap, strong, holds its own weight. My father taught me, she said, surprised he had noticed. He was a good builder, Liam said. He looked at the growing pile of excavated earth. What do you do with all the dirt? I'm banking it against the foundation, she explained. Extra insulation. In the spring, I'll plant herbs on it. He nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips. He wasn't laughing at her. He was appreciating the logic of it. A plan for everything. He looked up at the sky, which was the color of slate. My grandfather talks about the winter of '58. Says the snow was up to the eaves of the barn. They lost half their cattle. Couldn't get to them. Ilara met his gaze. He understood. He didn't think she was crazy. That's why, she said, and it was all the explanation she needed to give. Before he left, he looked at her hands, which were raw and blistered despite her thick gloves. The next week, when he brought her supplies, there was a small jar of lanolin salve included in the box, with no mention of it on the bill. Not everyone was so understanding. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was as broad as her bosom, arrived one afternoon bearing a still warm apple pie. She surveyed the scene with worried eyes, her brow furrowed. The trench now stretched all the way to the root cellar, a covered, timber-lined passage into the earth. Ilara, child, she began, her voice thick with concern. What is this? Silas Blackwood says you've dug a grave for yourself. It's a tunnel, Mrs. Gable. But what if it collapses? The spring thaw will shift the ground. All this work, it could be for nothing. Or worse, it's not safe for a young woman to be doing this kind of thing alone. She pressed the pie into Ilara's hands. You need to be careful. The valley is full of stories about folks who tried to tame it their own way. The ground is solid here, Ilara said calmly. It's shale and clay. My father tested it. She appreciated the concern, the warmth of the pie, but it didn't change anything. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. She finished the tunnel to the root cellar by the first week of November. She built a heavy, insulated door at the cabin end and a tight-fitting hatch inside the cellar itself. The first time she walked the entire 40 feet underground was a moment of quiet triumph. The air was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and fresh-cut pine. It was utterly silent, the world above completely gone. She lit a lantern, and the small, sturdy passage glowed with a warm, golden light. Fen padded along behind her, his nails making soft clicking sounds on the wooden floorboards she had laid. He sniffed at the walls, seemingly content with this new, strange den. Then she began the second tunnel, the longer and more ambitious one, stretching 80 feet from the cabin to the barn. This path crossed a section of softer soil, requiring deeper footings and heavier cross-bracing. The physical toll was immense. She woke before dawn, her body a single, unified ache, and worked until her muscles trembled with exhaustion. Some days, she felt a profound loneliness, a sense of her own smallness against the enormity of the task. In those moments, she would stop, place a hand on the cool, solid wood of a frame she had set, and feel her father's presence. She was not just building a tunnel. She was completing his last, greatest act of love. One afternoon, as she was wrestling a heavy ceiling beam into place, the rain-softened earth on one side of the trench gave way. It wasn't a major collapse, just a few 100 pounds of wet dirt and rock, but it was sudden and violent. It knocked her off her feet, pinning her leg. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only pain and the crushing weight. Fen began to bark frantically from the edge of the trench. With a surge of adrenaline, Ilara twisted and dug with her free hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps until she managed to pull her leg free. It was bruised and bleeding from a long gash, but not broken. She limped back to the cabin, shaking. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, stitched it closed with a steady hand as her father had taught her, and wrapped it tightly. The incident was a warning. It reminded her of the stakes. The next day, sore and limping, she was back in the trench, building a retaining wall for the unstable section, her movements more careful, more deliberate than ever. She would not be beaten by a little loose soil. As December arrived, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The sky was a permanent, heavy white. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The other homesteaders rushed through their final preparations, their faces grim. They saw Ilara, still hauling dirt, still setting timbers, and they shook their heads. The mad girl, digging her own tomb. Liam was her only regular visitor. He never stayed long, but his quiet presence was a comfort. He'd leave a coil of good rope, a bundle of dry kindling, or a new file for her saw, always placed discreetly on the porch. He never asked for thanks. One day he found her struggling to raise a particularly heavy support beam for the barn entrance. Without a word, he jumped down into the trench, took one end of the beam, and helped her hoist it into place. "Thank you," she said, her voice breathy with exertion. He just nodded. "Looks like you're almost done." "Almost," she agreed. "Good," he said, looking at the ominous sky. "The snow is coming." He was right. 2 days later, it began. It wasn't the gentle, picturesque snowfall of stories. It was a silent, purposeful, and terrifyingly swift descent of white. The flakes were small and dense, like grains of sand, and they were driven by a wind that didn't howl but hissed, a relentless, serpentine sound that crept through the tiniest cracks in the cabin walls. Ilara stood by the window for a long time, watching the world disappear. The familiar shapes of the woodpile, the fence line, the distant trees, all of them softened, then blurred, then vanished completely under the accumulating tide. The light outside grew strange, a dim, perpetual twilight. Fen whined softly, pressing against her leg. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. "It's all right, boy," she murmured. "We're ready." She checked the storm shutters one last time, making sure they were securely barred. She added another log to the stove, its warmth a defiant heart beating in the center of the cabin. Then she lit 2 kerosene lanterns, their steady glow pushing back the encroaching gloom. She picked one up, opened the heavy, insulated door in her floor, and stepped down into the darkness of her tunnel. The change was immediate and profound. The hissing of the wind vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The air was still and cool, but not frigid. The lantern light threw long, dancing shadows along the pine walls, a secure golden path stretching out before her. Fen followed, his paws making a soft, reassuring patter on the floorboards. She walked the 80 feet to the barn, the journey taking less than a minute. She pushed open the hatch at the other end and emerged into the familiar, comforting smell of hay and livestock. Her milk cow, Daisy, turned her head and lowed a greeting. The chickens clucked softly in their coop. They were warm, dry, and safe, oblivious to the storm that was burying the world. Ilara filled their feed troughs, topped off their water, and collected the day's eggs. She milked the cow, the rhythmic squirt of milk into the pail a sound of simple, profound normalcy. She did her chores with an unhurried calm, the storm raging just feet above her head, but unable to touch her. Back in the cabin, she made her way through the other tunnel to the root cellar. She retrieved potatoes, carrots, and a jar of her mother's preserved peaches. The shelves were laden with the bounty of her summer's labor, a fortress of sustenance. She had everything she needed. For 3 days she lived in this closed, self-sufficient world. She cooked, she mended a leather harness, she read her father's books by the light of the fire. She moved between her 3 small buildings with an ease that felt like a miracle. Above, the snow piled deeper and deeper. She could hear the weight of it groaning on the cabin roof. By the 3rd day, the windows were completely dark, buried behind a wall of white. The outside world had ceased to exist. It was just her, the dog, her animals, and the steadfast, silent tunnels. She felt no fear, only a deep, quiet gratitude for the stubborn man who had dreamed this, and for the strength he had given her to build it. On the 4th day, the sound came. It was faint, a frantic, muffled scratching at the main cabin door. Finn heard it first, his head lifting, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elara quieted him with a hand. She listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. There it was again, a desperate, exhausted thudding. It was impossible. The snow had to be at least 10 feet deep against that door. No one could be out there. No one could have survived. She grabbed a lantern and a shovel. She unbarred the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like trying to push open a mountain. The weight against it was immense. The scratching came again, weaker this time, followed by a cry so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind she could now hear rumbling above the snowpack. There was only one other way out. She went through the tunnel to the barn. The barn's main doors were also buried, but the hayloft door on the leeward side was higher up. If the drift wasn't too deep there, she might be able to get out. She climbed the ladder to the loft, the shovel in her hand. The wind was shrieking against the wood. With all her strength, she pushed the loft door open. It moved a few inches, then stopped, blocked by a solid wall of snow. She began to dig. She shoveled the snow into the hayloft, creating a small cave, then pushed herself into it, digging upward toward the surface. It was like tunneling through wet concrete. The snow was heavy, compacted by the wind. Finally, her shovel broke through into the open air. She scrambled out into a world that was utterly alien. The wind tore at her, a physical blow that stole her breath. The sky was a churning mass of gray. The landscape was gone, replaced by a rolling white desert. The only landmark was the top foot of her own chimney, smoke whipping from it, and the peak of her barn roof. Nothing else. No trees, no fences, just snow. The sound had come from the direction of the cabin door. She floundered through the deep, wind-packed snow, sinking to her waist with every step. It was a nightmare of exertion. Finally, she reached the place where the front of her cabin should be. She saw a deep hole dug into the snow, and at the bottom of it, a figure collapsed against her door. It was Liam. His face was caked in ice, his lips blue. He was barely conscious. He had somehow, miraculously, fought his way here from his own homestead a mile away. "My father," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Blackwood. Everyone. Trapped." She half-dragged, half-carried him back to the hayloft, a desperate, lung-searing journey. She got him down the ladder and through the tunnel into the warmth of her cabin. She stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in every blanket she had, placing him as close to the fire as was safe. She forced warm broth between his lips, drop by drop. As he slowly thawed, his shivering violent, he told her what had happened. The storm was worse than anyone had imagined. It had buried houses to their roofs in the first 2 days. Chimneys became blocked with snow and fires went out. People were trapped in the cold and the dark. Roofs were beginning to collapse under the immense weight. He had escaped through a second-story window and spent a day fighting his way to her, the smoke from her chimney his only guide. He believed she was the only one who might have been prepared. He was right. Her cabin was not just a home, it was now an ark, and her tunnels were the only passable roads in a drowned world. When Liam was strong enough to stand, they prepared for the rescue. They packed a small sled with blankets, broth, a lantern, and shovels. Their only way out was the tunnel they had dug from the hayloft. They emerged into the howling whiteness, two small figures in a vast, hostile landscape. The wind was a constant, brutal force, but the snow had lessened slightly. Liam, who had lived in this valley his whole life, navigated by instinct, by the subtle slope of the land beneath the snow. Their first stop was his family's homestead. They found the house almost completely submerged. Smoke, thin and pale, still trickled from a stovepipe they had managed to poke through the snowpack. They dug down to a second-story window, broke it, and called out. The relief in his father's voice was a tangible thing. They brought him and his mother out, weak and shivering with cold, and guided them back to the impossible warmth and safety of Alara's cabin. Next was the Gables. Their small home had vanished entirely. Liam located it by a lone fence post still visible above the drifts. They dug for an hour, their muscles burning, before they found the roofline. They chopped a hole through the shingles and found Mr. and Mrs. Gable huddled together in the attic, their fire long dead, their hope nearly gone. Mrs. Gable wept when she saw Alara, clinging to her, her earlier words of doubt forgotten, replaced by a desperate, grateful faith. The hardest rescue was Silas Blackwood. His large, sturdy house was on a rise, but the wind had scoured one side and built a monstrous drift against the other, burying it completely. They found him in the main room, the windows dark, the air frigid. He was sitting in a chair, wrapped in a quilt, his face gray and still. He had run out of wood. He was slowly freezing to death. He was too weak to walk. Alara and Liam half carried him through the blinding snow, a slow, agonizing procession. When they finally reached the hayloft and descended into the quiet, lantern-lit tunnel, a change came over the old man. His eyes, dull with cold, widened. He looked at the sturdy timber frames, the dry floorboards, the impossible passage carved through the frozen earth. He touched a wooden wall as if to assure himself it was real. They brought him into the cabin, a bustling sanctuary now filled with the survivors. Mrs. Gable pressed a mug of hot broth into his hands. He drank it slowly, his gaze fixed on Alara. The skepticism that had been etched onto his face for 60 years was gone, replaced by a profound, humbling awe. He looked at her, his voice hoarse. "You were right," he said. It was not an apology. It was a testament. Alara simply nodded, then turned to put another log on the fire. There was no need for any other words. The crackling flames, the warm cabin, the breathing of the people she had sheltered. They said everything. The great blizzard, which the survivors would forever call the White Death, raged for 9 days. For 9 days, Alara's cabin was the heart of the valley. Her tunnels were the arteries that had allowed life to be saved. She shared her food, her warmth, her quiet strength without hesitation. The skeptics who had mocked her now looked at her with a reverence usually reserved for preachers or saints. They saw that her father's crazy ideas and her own stubborn labor had been an act of profound wisdom. When the storm finally broke, it revealed a world broken and remade. The sun shone on a landscape of terrifying beauty. The valley was a sea of white, punctuated by the wreckage of crushed barns and buried homes. The work of survival was replaced by the work of rebuilding, and it was Alara they turned to. They asked for her father's journals. She brought them out, the pages worn and soft from 100 readings. She shared the designs, the calculations, the knowledge of how to brace against the earth, how to build for the worst winter, not the best summer. That spring, the sound of digging and sawing echoed throughout the valley. Men who had once shaken their heads at her now sought her advice on choosing a location, on setting a foundation. They didn't build tunnels as elaborate as hers, but they built winter walks, simple, shored-up passages connecting their own homes to their barns and cellars. The Cellar way, they called it. A new kind of folk wisdom had been born, paid for in blisters and vindicated by the storm. The years that followed were kind. The winters were cold, but never again so brutal. The valley healed. The community grew stronger, bound together by the shared memory of the White Death and the quiet girl who had seen it coming. Ilara never married, but her cabin was never lonely. Liam remained her closest friend, a constant presence in her life until he passed peacefully in his 70s. The children of the people she had saved grew up visiting her, bringing her gifts of bread and honey and listening to her stories. Fen grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent his days sleeping by the fire, his dreams filled with the twitching of paws. One autumn evening, years after the great storm, he lay in his usual spot, his breathing shallow. Ilara sat on the floor beside him, her hand resting on his flank, feeling the slow, faint beat of his heart. She stayed with him through the night, and just before dawn, he gave a soft sigh and was still. In the spring, she buried him on the small hill behind the cabin, beneath a young pine tree, in a spot overlooking the home he had so patiently guarded. Time flowed on, a steady river. Ilara's hair turned the color of snow. Her hands, once so strong, became gnarled with age, but her eyes remained clear and sharp. She became the valley's matriarch, a living link to its defining legend. The tunnels, which she maintained for as long as she was able, became a part of the landscape, their entrances overgrown with wild roses in the summer and disappearing under soft blankets of snow in the winter. She died in her sleep one night, in the bed her father had built, in the cabin she had made a sanctuary. She was 93 years old. The entire valley turned out for her funeral. They buried her on the hill beside Fen. Her grave marker was a simple stone, carved by the grandson of Silas Blackwood. It read, Ilara. She dug deep and sheltered all. Decades later, a new family lived in the old cabin. They were young, with children whose laughter echoed in the rooms. They knew the stories, of course. On a cold, blustery afternoon, with the first snow of the season beginning to fall, the mother needed to fetch potatoes for dinner. The wind was sharp, and the air had a bite that promised a cold night. "I'll go," her 7-year-old son shouted. He didn't pull on his heavy coat or boots. Instead, he ran to the old, thick door in the floor. He lifted it, revealing the dark, earthen-smelling passage below. He grabbed a battery-powered lantern from a hook, flicked it on, and disappeared down the steps, his small feet thumping on the old wooden floorboards. A moment later, his light could be seen emerging in the root cellar, a small, brave glow in the heart of the earth. The tunnel stood. It endured. It was no longer a marvel or a folly, but simply a part of life. A quiet, sturdy testament to the girl who had listened to the wisdom of the earth and the warnings of the past. It was a monument not of stone or bronze, but of dirt and timber and foresight, a legacy of warmth and safety, built by a pair of stubborn hands, reaching through the years to shelter the future.